interpretation of the state engineer's office in the past and the export statute, which is 41.3.115. It says none of the water of the state, either surface or underground water, may be appropriated, stored, or diverted. And under the System Conservation Pilot Program, the water wasn't appropriated. It was water that was appropriated for irrigation exclusively under the previous program that they just didn't use. It wasn't appropriated otherwise for use outside of the state. It wasn't stored for use outside of the state, and it wasn't diverted for use outside of the state. We have many examples in Wyoming where that is true. We have ditches that divert in Wyoming for use in Idaho, for use in Utah, for use in Colorado, for use in Montana, for use in Nebraska. We have many diversions that are like that. The ditch diverts in the stream in Wyoming, and it takes that water across the state line for use in the adjoining state. We have storage water. The vast majority of Pathfinder Reservoir is used in Nebraska. So we have those contexts, those types where the use is specifically identified in the other state. And our interpretation of that statute was that it did not apply to system conservation because there was no identified use in another state. It just became water in the stream that was available for anybody to pick up and use. So just some context behind how we viewed it, a little bit about the program. It got kicked up again last year simply because the very dire consequences the basin found itself in, and for a whole lot of reasons that I'm not sure we need to get into, we decided to start it back up last year.
Yeah, I think it would be.
We'll go a follow-up here first, Representative, and then we'll go to you, okay?
No, I think it's helpful, but I think it's going to be a case by case scenario, and in particularly on the different issues. And so the question became, and this came up really for in that coal bed methane play in our area down there, that and also the one was seriously looking at potential monetizing that water, and the value of it's out of state. Wasn't for irrigation purposes in the state of Wyoming. So it's just, how do you go about making those determinations? So what I heard was it would be based on a detailed geological investigation for groundwater connectivity and stuff. The question is, where does that burden of responsibility lie? Is it on the proponent or the state to demonstrate it's a single source of supply?
Madam Chairman, that's probably a good question. I think it probably lies on us to ask the right questions and to understand if it is the same aquifer, if they're completely different aquifers in the case of a groundwater situation. And then an analysis, are they connected enough that it would be the same source of supply still or not? So I think there's a lot of detail and a lot of questions and investigations that we're going to require of the applicant to help inform us.
So, Madam Chairman, just to follow up on the SCCP, and I think that's probably a correct interpretation, but it becomes back to a policy question for the legislature. If we're just fine having downstream basin states or water users, like I think some of the ones that contributed to that fund were Metropolitan Water District in California, I believe Phoenix, Southern Nevada Water Authority, paid people to allow water run down the state, whether that's a policy that the state of Wyoming at some point in time, AKA the legislature, thinks is important enough that we need to track and understand that how much water is actually leaving under these voluntary type agreements. Under this current statutory framework, I would agree that was probably the right interpretation. My concern is what if this all of a sudden becomes tens and then all of a sudden 50s and then it's 100,000 acre feet of water? There's nothing that would preclude that under we would never know about it. And so as it's a policy decision of the legislature, do we go into the export statutes and say, even under those type of programs, there at least has to be some level of reporting as to how much water is leaving the state? At the very least, we'd like to know that. I would think the state engineer's office would like to know that too, but currently it would be a voluntary effort on the part of the Board of Control to actually track that. Under that program, they did try to track and make some estimates of how much that was. But I don't know that we have the adequate framework that would require that reporting from some entity to come up there and pay somebody just to allow water to run out of the state of Wyoming. That's the policy issue.
So I think Senator Hicks brings up a really good point. Is that something that we could work on and see if you could find a way to that, you know, to deal with that or some ideas, since we've just kind of brought this up to you and we didn't really put a lot of detail in water export statutes. We kind of have blindsided you today as far as what we were looking for.
Well,
yeah.
Chairman, and so I had the conversation with the state engineer. I said, look, this is a conversation for the committee to have. There's a couple of issues out here. Do we want to take these up? But it was just to have this conversation.
Yeah.
So
All right, Representative Summers.
Madam Chairman, thank you. Just some history for me, if you know it. So what was the magical number 1,000 for one, in the statute, why 1,000, not 500, not 10,000? And then, and this should be on me to find out, but I just got the email from David getting me caught up to speed. So apparently in 1985, we changed a whole lot of this law. And so could you give me just a little history on this and including the amount? And then on the issue of the system conservation pilot project, I think at the point in time when they say if the federal government ever said to involve this program, we want you to shepherd that water, then I think that would actually be diverting water. And then it would fall under the statute. So my question is, similar to Senator Hicks, what happens if at some point in that program, they just say, we want you to shepherd that water that we're buying to just run down the river? Will that then trigger this statute? That would be my question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, Mr. Speaker, I'll do my best. And maybe to go back in history a little bit, where the first iteration of this statute was whenever it was in the 70s. And I think a large motivator behind it was the coal slurry type of projects that were being anticipated at the time, not only in the powder, but also the green. There was quite a large project being considered. If you look even further back, all the way back to the turn of the century in the late 1900s, there's been different iterations of statutes that Wyoming has had, sometimes none at all. But I think for a large portion of that history, you had statute that says you will not do it. And then you had a portion, you will not divert water in Wyoming for use in another state. And then you had a series of statutory changes, as if I recall, and it's been a while since I've researched this, so I'm trying to pull it out of my brain, where any diversion required legislative approval. And you can go back in some of those statutes and see legislative approval for some of the smallest ditches. So as I mentioned, there's ditches on every border where water is diverted in Wyoming for use in another state. And for a period of time in Wyoming's history, the legislature had to approve all of them. So that's my best understanding of why there is 1,000 acre-foot limit. They didn't want to be bothered with the small stuff. That's the best. And why they chose 1,000, I haven't come across whether or not that number is magic in some way. I assumed, I guess, in the past, when I looked into the history of it, it was simply something that seemed big, and it's the big ones that the legislature wants to look at, not the really small ones. And that's my best guess as far as the number. The 1985 changes or the 1980s changes were in direct response to a case in the United States Supreme Court called Sporhays v. Nebraska. And I'll try to pull that out of my brain as best as I can as well. But that was a dormant commerce clause question. So under federal law, whether or not the states could regulate interstate commerce, and directly at issue in the case was whether or not water was an article of interstate commerce. And if so, could the states regulate water as something in interstate commerce. And the United States Supreme Court in Sporehase v. Nebraska said it was an article of interstate commerce, that is the responsibility of the federal government to regulate that article of interstate commerce. And so if the state had any rules or laws which precluded the ability of that interstate commerce from happening, then it was in violation of the United States Constitution. And so the changes that were made to Wyoming statute were explicitly in response to that case. And you see all of the considerations that were added on to the bottom of it, specifically penned by a fairly famous Wyoming water law professor named Frank Trelease, in an attempt to not just subjectively limit out-of-state water transfers, but to identify some very important state interests. So it's not that you can't never potentially prevent these interstate water transfers. If you have really good reasons, you can do it. And many of the Western states after that case came up with something similar like this. I can tell you that it got challenged a couple of times in New Mexico with something similar, and New Mexico lost both times. Ours has never been challenged, but it certainly is a question. There was, and I don't know how much more detail I need to get into, but that was the whole point of the big 1985 changes, was to say the legislature in the past had said, no, you're not doing it at all. The United States Supreme Court says you can't have a statute that says that. Water is an article of interstate commerce. You can't regulate it unless you got a really good reason. And the point behind these considerations was to identify what that really good reason might be. Another thing to think about, that the water right in Sporehase v. Nebraska was an already appropriated water right, and they attempted to transfer that right to Colorado. So it was already a real property right, because all water rights are real property rights owned by the appropriator. And the Supreme Court said in that context, you couldn't inhibit that interstate commerce. Part of this is designed to look at specifically brand new appropriations. And there's some legal theory out there that under brand new appropriations, a state might have more leeway with regard to preventing those. That was taken up a little bit in, it was the city of Tarrant versus Oklahoma, United States Supreme Court case. Laying on top of that, if you have an interstate compact that has been approved by Congress, where they have in essence weighed in on the ability to transfer water interstate, then Congress has spoken. The Dormant Commerce Clause does not apply, and any restrictions that flow from the interstate agreement therefore do not violate the Commerce Clause. So some of our interstate compacts, I would argue that analysis would apply. I've argued in the past that that applies in the Colorado River Basin. It wouldn't apply in all of our basins. And that's simply the primary question in those contexts, is whether or not under the interstate compact apportionment, whether or not it apportioned all of the water available in the system. That's the question in those cases. So I'm not sure if I gave you more than you wanted, but that's my memory of it.
Follow up, okay.
Madam Chairman, thank you. So the case where, let's say, you know, me being an irrigator, a water right holder on the Green River, if I've always thought, well, you can't sell it, right? Unless you sell under 1,000 acre feet or whatever. But that has never been tested then in Wyoming court, right? Whether I could actually sell water to another entity, because that's a water right.
Madam Chair and Mr. Speaker, I obviously wasn't clear. What hasn't been tested is if somebody came to the Wyoming State Engineer and made an application either for a new water right or an existing water right and said, I want to either transfer my existing water right or appropriate new water for use outside of the state, and it's more than 1,000 acre feet. It comes in front of the state engineer. He says it's more than 1,000 acre feet. I've got to go through this statutory review process, come up with my report, make a recommendation to the legislature, and the legislature says no. Based upon these considerations, that hasn't been tested. That's what happened in New Mexico where the attempt was made to appropriate water outside of the state. The New Mexico legislature said no, and the United States Supreme Court says, no, that's wrong. That's in violation of the Dormant Commerce Clause, and therefore they set aside that decision to say, no, that's not what's been tested. If something came in front of you, let's say Green River Pipeline, perhaps, and the legislature said no, after the state engineer did his review, that would be challenged under the Dormant Commerce Clause, and we'd have to defend the decision.
All right, anything else? Okay. So Senator Hicks, did you want some recommendations from the office as far as to how we proceed, or what are your thoughts on this? This is your topic.
Madam Chairman, I think the issue of that we saw with the SCCP where lower basin or out-of-state entities are paying, just out-of-state entities are paying people to allow water to run downstream. And the reason that we captured that is because the state of Wyoming, through the state engineer's office, actually administered that program. But how would we capture that and understand how much is being moved under that scenario if it hadn't been for the state engineer's office administering that program? So I'm just trying to think, is there an administrative way that we can go in there and say, look, if these type of scenarios are out there, that they're going to be, there's a reporting requirement that we know how much, who's paying and how much water is moving out of state under these type of agreements. And so I don't know, we need an answer now. Again, it was something to think about. Maybe at our next
just have-
meeting, you could come back, but
Yeah, and I appreciate that, Madam Chair, the ability to think on it. I just would have 2 points to make. That you're exactly right. The SCPP, the first time I understand, was paid by largely lower basin entities. This current version, that funding is through the Bureau of Reclamation, the infrastructure, the IIJA money, IREF money, funded that program. So that funding coming from the federal government on this one. As far as accounting for the SCPP program specifically, I think the best that we can do is just to document the agreements and the contracts that the water users signed, that they intentionally conserve this amount of consumptive use. Being able to track it and monitoring it wasn't part of the program, and we haven't been able to do that. I do think, though, if we go into demand management, we're definitely going to have a better handle on measurement and tracking and things like that. So absolutely, we should have better information, and will need better information under some sort of program if that were to ever get stood up or something similar. But we can certainly give you the ski agreements, that total volume of what was conserved, the consumptive use conserved.
Madam Chair, if I might just add a couple of things. Under the previous program, additional funders were Denver Water and Bureau of Reclamation. So you had those three big municipal entities in the lower basin, plus the federal government and Denver Water, just to round it out. Both programs, both the previous program, the current program, are not administered by the state engineer's office, but the Upper Colorado River Commission. Certainly, we play a role in that. We review all the contracts. We try to assure that whoever's applying for it actually owns the water rights, that they've got the water rights on the land, that there's historic consumptive use associated with that right. So we really have played a role in also taking a look to see whether or not there's any obvious injury associated with that. So, and then with regard to reporting, under the first program, there was a report that was developed by the Upper Colorado River Commission, and a swag taken it, how much gets to the mainstream, so that you can make a better assumption about whether or not it makes it downstream. With regard to the current program and the funding agreement the Upper Colorado River Commission has with the Bureau of Reclamation, there's also a reporting requirement that will identify both the amount of water saved within each state, at least pursuant to the system conservation implementation agreements. Those are the agreements between the UCRC and the individual water user. So there will be a report associated with that, a requirement at the end. That was part of the federal authorization that there be a report developed. And so that has been passed on to the UCRC that's hired a contractor to implement all of that stuff. With regard to, I think you asked a specific question as far as demand management, how might this fit in there? And is it more like a diversion for use out of state? And I think that is one of the very many remaining questions associated with demand management. I think there's a provision in the demand management storage agreement that was part of the 2019 DCP that requires that any demand management program comply with state law in the state in which it occurs. And I think in conversations that we've had with our stakeholder group, with now the advisory committee, I think we've had some discussions. There might need to be some legislative, not necessarily in the export statute, maybe, but there could be some need for additional statutory language to accommodate, to account for it, even recognize a demand management program related to things like shepherding, related to things like abandonment, related to things potentially like export. So I think there's a recognition that if we ever got to a demand management program, there's likely going to need to be some sort of legislative recognition, sideboards, whatever it is, that would allow that type of a program to operate, because it really is not like doctrine of appropriation. So we probably need to be thinking about how do we make that work from a policy standpoint? How might that work within the state of Wyoming? That's part of the feasibility investigation that continues to go on with regard to demand management.
Madam Chairman.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Your abandonment statement kind of drew a red flag. So if someone was selling their water by not just using it without anybody knowing about it, I mean, they're just not using it. They could abandonment could come about, I guess. Is that correct? After the 5 years?
Madam Chair, Senator, absolutely. And one of the reasons, and it wasn't the only reason, but one of the reasons that we stopped the program in 2018 is it's been going on 4 years. And we did not want to put any of Wyoming water rights at risk. I don't recall, as I'm sitting here, whether or not we had participants that have been in all 4 years. But that was one of the reasons why we stopped it in 2018, was that very concern. Doesn't make it automatically abandoned. Some action has to be taken in front of the Board of Control, and the Board of Control has to find abandonment. But after 5 years in Wyoming, and then there's questions under Wyoming's abandonment statute. Do you suffer, or could you potentially suffer partial abandonment? Those sorts of things. So that definitely is a concern. That definitely is. And another requirement in the demand management storage agreement that we signed back in 2019 is that the program cannot negatively affect existing water rights. And so that is something we very keenly, the whole point, I think, of a demand management program is to avoid a buy and dry, avoid permanent transfers, avoid negative impact to existing rights, provide a temporary opportunity to help with compact compliance. The demand management storage agreement was all about compact compliance. And this was to provide a temporary, voluntary, and compensated way, instead of just through priority regulation where folks might get turned off without any compensation. So that was the whole point of the demand management storage agreement.
All right, follow up.
Follow up, yeah. This kind of goes back to our last discussion. I was just hoping we can get a comment on how we're doing with providing water to Lee's Ferry. Are we close, like a couple of years away from having to go to a curtailment or such?
Madam Chair and Senator, I'll first say that my crystal ball's just as good or bad as anybody's. But at the end of this year, depending upon how it turns out, and I don't need to get into that, we're expecting the 10-year total flow at Lee Ferry to be around 86.5 million acre feet. The first pinch point under the compact is, of course, 8.25 million acre feet. Right now, the position of Wyoming and the upper division states is that we would not curtail any time before 75 million acre feet in 10 years. And just looking at what you might conjure up is really bad hydrology for the next few years, we would not expect to hit that 75 million over 10 years until 2028 at the earliest. And so it is not next year. It's not the year after that. It's not the year after that. What we're looking at is some years down the road. And everything that we're doing is because we don't know what the hydrology is looking like, and we want to be prepared if it does continue to be bad, like it has since 2000, except this year, everywhere, right?
Go ahead, Representative Summers.
Madam Chairman, sorry, just on that issue there, this year that came about. If you would have done that same projection a year or more ago to give it in some context of what this winter meant, could you do that?
Madam Chair, Mr. Speaker, absolutely. You probably remember a headline in one of our online newspapers that says the state of Wyoming is going to turn people off in 2025, which is not what I said in that meeting. So yeah, what we were anticipating, and again, it's a crystal ball exercise. You got to anticipate whether it's going to snow next year, and I don't know. But taking the best projections of the very smart people that make projections, we're anticipating the potential of needing to start turning people off in 2025, maybe. And this year, in the context of what has happened, that has kicked us out to 2028 is my best guess as I'm sitting here now and talking with people that know something about it. So this year definitely helped significantly, not only with regard to recharging Lake Powell to a certain degree, but because of the lower elevation balancing rules in Lake Powell, we're moving about 9 million acre feet down to Lake Mead this year, which of course, while it drains storage out of Lake Powell, it helps us as our leaf area average. So it's a mixed blessing of sorts, but it certainly has helped give us some breathing room and probably more breathing room to the lower basin than to the upper basin, in my opinion.
All right. Any further questions? All right. Thank you, fellas. We appreciate all the information you've given us and all the education in Wyoming water law. With that, I want to take public comment on both the water banking or water export statutes. Would there be any public comment in the room or online? All right, seeing none, I would like to recognize Mayor Hall of Cody who is here in the room with us. Mayor, we're running a little behind schedule, but if you'd like to take a moment to address us, we'd sure appreciate it. And thank you for welcoming us to your wonderful town.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. You stole my thunder. I just want to appreciate the Select Water for coming to our town today. We brought out some good weather for you. So hopefully in your tours or your time around town, you'll enjoy it and enjoy some of our downtown activities this evening with restaurants and whatnot. But appreciate all the hard work that this committee does. And again, welcome to Cody.
Thank you, Mayor. We appreciate you stopping by. All right. Okay, we're on to our last order of business. Before we go there, commissioners, thank you for sticking in with us. Do you have any comments on what we've discussed so far today? No comments? All right. All right, well, we'll save it for this afternoon then. Next would be our temporary water use agreements. We have a bill. If David, you would want to come take us through that bill, we would certainly appreciate that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. David Hopkinson with the Legislative Service Office. Walking through, we're looking at 24 LSO 130 working draft 0.3 temporary water use agreements. The first thing to note, there is a staff comment that essentially says there are a number of different ways to accomplish the purposes of this bill, and there may be better ways to do that. It kind of ultimately depends on the decisions if the committee chooses to take this up on exactly what decisions are made there. So what this bill does is it creates a new section 41.3.117, and this section is essentially very similar or almost identical in most aspects to existing statute which is found in 41.3.110 through 41.3.112, dealing with temporary water use agreements. The differences are primarily those other statutes have language in there that kind of focus on construction, highway projects, that sort of thing, and has some language related to that is removed in this new section. And then it also this new section has some language that would clarify or specify that the temporary transfers may be renewed and how that could be done. And so just walking through then, beginning here, subsection A on page 2 just provides that any person has the right to temporarily acquire by purchase, gift, or lease the right to use of water in any adjudicated or valid unadjudicated right or any of their portion thereof for a period not to exceed, and here we see some X's. This would be a policy question. How long should that temporary use be for? And then it requires that beneficial use, that it be for a beneficial use consistent with our beneficial use statute. That provides then that any temporary transfer may be renewed, subject to the application procedure and limitations of the section. And that any temporary transfer is only allowed if no other appropriator is injured thereby. And that's, as I indicated, existing law also requires that temporary transfer be allowed only if no other appropriator is injured thereby. But the differences there would be that temporary transfer may be renewed and subject to the application procedures. That's not seen in existing statute. Subsection B provides that before any right to such use becomes operative, that an application has to be filed with the state engineer. The state engineer, upon approval, will issue an order authorizing the use and specifying the method, place, and period of use. No loss, abandonment, or impairment of such water rights shall occur or attach as a result of such change of use, except as provided by said conveyance or agreement and order of the state engineer. And upon termination of the temporary diversion and use, any affected right to use the water shall automatically be reinvested with all the rights, privileges, and uses and purposes theretofore held and enjoyed. Subsection C provides, kind of in summary, that only that portion of the water right acquired, which has been consumptively used under the historical use made of that water right, may be diverted through that temporary agreement. And then it provides just kind of some language there to deal with the return flows and the presumption of those return flows and how they can be adjusted. Subsection D provides the state engineer assesses a fee not to exceed $100, and that fee is credited to the general fund. Subsection E provides that the owner of any permanent water right, whether prior or subsequent in priority to the temporary right, who cannot satisfy in full his right during that temporary use, shall have the absolute right upon demand to cause such diversion to be shut off. In other words, that section, if there is a junior appropriator or a person with a junior right, that temporary right cannot injure him. And he would be able, that person would be able to demand that temporary use be halted. Subsection F just provides that it's unlawful for any person to wrongfully cause a diversion made under a temporary water right, and that any violation of this section is punishable by 41.3.616, which provides that it's a misdemeanor punishable by up to I believe a $1,250 fine and 3 months in jail, if I remember right. Section 2 is just kind of conforming language, which goes into the prescriptive easement statutes that the legislature passed last year, and adds the new section that would be created to that exclusion that a temporary change of use under the new statute would not be deemed or would not interrupt the proclaimed 10-year period to achieve a prescriptive easement. With that, I would stand for any questions.
Go ahead.
So, Madam Chairman, thank you. And David, thank you, but, and maybe I missed it, but would you go out over your staff comment?
Sure.
And the general premise behind your comment is should we consider amending the existing statute rather than creating new statutes? So could you go over some of that
Sure,
for us?
absolutely. Madam Chair, the comment is really just kind of saying, you know, there may be a better way to do this depending on what changes the committee wants. If we're just looking at changing or altering the time frame for a temporary use, then perhaps just amending existing statutes makes more sense. It might make more sense just to go into the existing statutes. If we're looking at just clarifying who can use the temporary use, and perhaps just going into the statutes and kind of removing the language that seems limiting, for example, the construction, the railroad uses, there could be some tweaks that could be made there to clarify that this really is intended to be broad. And so then it probably makes more sense just to go into the existing statute. So that the purpose of that staff comment is just to highlight, you know, depending on what the committee or how the committee wants to proceed, it may make more sense just to amend existing statute rather than creating a new section.
Go ahead.
Madam, excuse me, Madam Chairman, thank you. So David, because I haven't tracked existing statute and this statute, can you tell me what are the, other than the XXX, which I obviously get is a difference. What are the differences between the proposed bill and what's in existing statute? And go line by line on that. So take me right to it.
Absolutely. So the changes really kind of, again, going line by line then, on line 21 on page 2, there's language there about the beneficial use being consistent with 41.3.101. I don't believe that's an existing statute. I would need to double check, but just off the top of my head, I want to say that that's new. I know for sure 21, 22, and 23, that sentence there, any temporary transfer, that's new language to allow for the renewal. And then, of course, as you indicated, that the time period is different for the period of years. And then the other differences, which aren't in the bill draft, are simply references specifically to things like the highway construction, railroads, that sort of thing. So though that's an existing statute that has been removed in this bill. So those references, and really that's primarily the differences between the two.
Just one more follow-up, Madam Chairman.
Go ahead.
So David, in existing statute, kind of where is that? Is it only for, because we use temporary use for a lot of things, not just what you defined. So what's the difference, I guess? What are we talking about specifically? Can you go, do you have it in front of you, the old statute? Or you
I don't, but I can grab my.
Yeah, please do.
So the existing statutes 41.3, 110 through 112. Just pulling that up. And so if you look at 41.3, 110, it's got A, B, C, and D, which the language there, other than those changes I highlighted in subsection A, are essentially the same. The language there through those first through, and then in the bill draft, section E is essentially 41.3, 111. And then F is essentially 41.3, 112. So the existing statute, and particularly the section headers there in 41.3.110, right to acquire temporary water rights for highway or railroad roadbed construction or repair. And then application restrictions fee. I think there was some concern that that could be seen or confusing to someone who's reading the statute and might think, you know, this is intended for highway or railroad roadbed construction or repair, when the way it's drafted or the way the existing language reads, and I think the way it's been interpreted by the state engineer's office is it is broader than that. That it isn't just limited to highway or railroad construction or repair, but that a temporary use can be used. And I believe the language in there just has that or other temporary purposes has been interpreted to be broad so long as it's for a beneficial use.
All right, go ahead.
So, Madam Chairman, just, there's, and this is, I just don't remember. Can we amend title?
Absolutely. And I will need to double check, but I'm not sure that that the legislature would necessarily need to take action. Those titles, generally speaking, aren't intended and have no real interpretive purpose. Those are actually just put into place and can often be tweaked just by LSO as needed. They aren't something that are deemed part of the statute. As it were.
So, Madam
All
Chair,
right, go ahead.
I'm
Senator Hicks.
kind of on the same track as Representative Summers. It looks to me like we could vastly simplify this by just going into 41.3.110, 41.3.111, and 41.3.112, and just changing those to read right to acquire temporary water rights for other purposes, and just strike out railroad construction and repair. It accomplishes the exact same thing by just amending those three. The problem is the way it says is it's railroad bed construction and repair. You got to go all the way into 41.3.110, and then it comes, it says other temporary purposes. And that's the catch-all that the state engineer's office has been using, but that's the one that it's pretty embedded and hard to find that. So the intent of this was not to do anything other than simplify the statute. So when you wanted to do a temporary water use agreement, you knew exactly where to go and not have to sort through that it's only for railroads and highway construction. And it's just them other temporary purposes is really what we're trying to get at and say that's what the purpose of these temporary water use agreements are. So then the only policy question left up is do we want to change that from 2 years to longer? But I think that would accomplish exactly what I was trying to get at, was just to simplify it. So when you went to the statutes, you could find out where to do a temporary change of use.
Go ahead.
Madam Chairman, thank you. And I think the language that he highlighted, and this goes to we had this discussion about temporary use, certainty, and certainly the additional language of any temporary transfer may be renewed subject to the application procedure and limitations in this section. That's new language, is correct?
Correct.
And so I would assume, and this would be a question to Senator Hicks, I would assume that language is to provide that certainty to understand that these are renewable. And then I guess when we get the agencies up here, the agency and the Attorney General, we can ask, is this needed or whatever, but I assume you're putting that in there to get to that certainty issue that we've been wondering about. Is that correct, Senator?
Go ahead.
That's accurate.
Microphone.
Madam Chairman and Representative Summer, I think that's accurate, and that's why under the current, it's, it's 2 years, and if you go to page 2, line 2, it leaves that blank. I mean, it's XXX. But I think I would say that your characterization is accurate.
All right. Why don't we bring the agency up if there's no further questions for David? No further questions, seeing none. Boy, we've got you guys on the hot seat today. It's water. All right. I'm assuming you've read the bill draft and have some ideas.
Madam Chair, thank you. Yes, and the first thing I wanted to do, some of the discussion I heard is absolutely correct. The term other temporary purposes is what we interpret quite broadly. I brought some of the temporary water use agreements we've done over the last 2 years. In 2022, we approved 70 temporary water use agreements. So far this year, we're at 60. And the types of projects that we're approving these for are oil and gas, which are 27 of the seven, about 54 of the total of the last 2 years. Road construction and maintenance, construction for wind energy, other construction, including sand and gravel. We have a couple with 2 reservoirs to help us track reservoir sales, storage reservoir sales to irrigation through the Bureau. When the Bureau sells that, we just use this to track that. So we have 11 of those over the last 2 years, and then 22 other uses. Those are things like temporary watering for a ski club in Casper, for temporary watering for cemetery, temporary purposes. And that's the gist of how we look at this. It's for a temporary use or a temporary purpose. And so we have issued these from time to time for even municipal use in a situation where an allocation could harm their water supply. We have set up a temporary water use agreement for that purpose. The allocation on that supply is what we viewed as the temporary purpose. So that's how we've been looking at this under the existing language. So I hope that helps with some of that.
My question would be on section D, where you are able to assess the fee and they have an application. Do they have to do that every 2 years then? And this contemplates changing that process.
Yeah, Madam Chair, and that's the needle to thread is we want these to be temporary. These are intended to be an easier approach, but where a permanent change is needed, we've got avenues for that. Those typically take a little more detailed injury analysis and investigation as we go through those permitting process. So that's the fine needle, is what is a temporary purpose. And so we have allowed these renewals, and basically it's not a renewal, but it's a new temporary water use agreement for the same person for the same purpose. And we do allow that currently. And again, it's tied to some sort of temporary purpose or temporary use. So I don't know, up to 5 years. I think the intent of this is to maybe provide a little more certainty for somebody who wanted to enter that, I think what I heard. But that's entirely a policy call on your part.
Senator Larson.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Currently, is there kind of an idea where you're at maybe 10 years or 8 years that they've been going through this process of temporary use? Do you kind of get to a point where you say you need to go permanent? Because I have seen that.
Madam Chair, yes. In fact, I've got 2 on my desk right now that we are noticing them, that this is the last one. You need to make a permanent change. And that's that fine line about what's a permanent use and what's a temporary use.
Follow up with Senator Larson, then we'll go to you.
Madam Chairman. So is that variable? Are you at like 8 years or 10 years of this going on? Or how do you determine that?
Madam Chairman, Senator Larson, it is variable, and I think it is, some of the ones we're seeing, they're using the water every year. And those are the ones we're saying no. Other ones we do extend, they may never use the water, but it's there when they need it. So that is also a temporary purpose. And it allows a lot of times it allows the original water right holder to continue what he's doing until it's needed.
All right, Representative Summers.
Madam Chairman, thank you. So a couple of questions on, one be, what are your thoughts on the bill? If we did it, should we just go ahead and amend existing statute rather than kind of create a separate statute? And then what about this language? Any temporary transfer may be renewed subject to the application procedure. So does that give you more authority to allow temporary transfers to exist longer? You're making a judgment call on who you're turning on and who you're turning off on this deal. And rather than anything that exists in statutory form. So does this allow those water transfers to go on because I actually do like these structures, these temporary, I think that's the way to get to this banking thing. Is you do, fine, you do 50 years of them, I don't really care. And that leads to my last question. So one is the structure better in just amending existing statute? What do you think about the added language of any temporary transfer may be renewed subject to the application? And then my last question, and this goes to Senator Larson's question, what's the longest term water lease that you've had, or temporary water lease that you've had? How many years what's our longest renewal, and for what use?
Madam Chair, Mr. Speaker, the last question, I don't have that information. I can get it and email the group. I don't have that with me to know what the longest was. So I don't even want to guess. To your other question about an automatic renewal in the statute. I think I like the ability that they identify it as something limited, with the understanding that they could come back in. But the whole purpose of this is to be temporary. And by just allowing a renewal, then what does that look like? They just continue to go without any additional paperwork. I think it helps provide us a check every time they come in to say, what are you using it for? How much are you using? Should we be requesting a permanent change or a temporary change? And that would just be my preference on that component of it. And did I answer all your questions? Do you have one more?
Follow up, go ahead.
Yeah, follow up, Madam Chairman, thank you. Well, the other one was, is it better to, and maybe this is for the Attorney General, is should we, be amending the existing statute if we do this? And kind of my other question to him would be, what are the pitfalls in any of this language? And I guess I think there's a good reason to take a really hard look at this and consider doing something like this, because we don't want to, we don't want inconsistencies. So you got a cemetery that you're going, okay, you only get 3 years, you only get 3 renewals on this. But power plant, we're going to give you 30 years, 20 years. So that's an inconsistency that I would say might exist in law. Now you'll tell me whether it does or doesn't. And then if it's not, then, should we be doing this? I think we need to consider something like this to get that certainty that the Attorney General mentioned before. So what is the certainty if we create these structures? Because we know right now Trona is going down and looking at these structures, this sort of thing on the Colorado River. And so ultimately, we have to create some structure that works for both agriculture and industry or municipalities. And if it's not this, what is it? And so that's my question to the combination of you two.
Go ahead. Sure.
Madam Chair, Mr. Speaker, I guess as far as any preference I might have, and I'll be honest with you, I haven't thought about it at length, but it seems to me that the narrow changes here would make more sense to amend the existing statute than come up with brand new ones. I find that when I'm trying to research the history of a statute, you get this gap where you get this brand new statute, then you got to go figure out what might have preceded it. And you can't track the numbers backwards. So that's my personal preference for whatever that's worth. I think amending these existing statute makes sense. As far as thoughts about the existing proposed amendment, I think the biggest concern, at least with regard to how this has been applied in the past, is taking out the temporary purpose concept. And because if you open it up to something that's not a temporary purpose, that creates a whole lot of problems. So if it's still limited to temporary purposes, the list that was previously listed, plus the catch-all or something like that, I think that is really the guts of this statute. And state engineer decisions, there's even a formal attorney general opinion that really focused on that temporary purpose nature of this statute. So if you change that, you're really, in my view, at least as I've looked at it in the past, really changing how this statute works. As far as the length of time, to my knowledge, the longest one that, and I probably shouldn't say anything either, but at least in my experience, the longest one I'm aware of was 20 years. And it was for municipal supply. And I know that it came in front of the Board of Control where it converted finally into a permanent change. And they really struggled with how to handle that permanent change on the heels of so many years of having the temporary use in place. And do you consider the use that was made under the original right? Do you consider the use that was made under the temporary right? How do you figure out what is the appropriate level of injury analysis when I'm not using it the way that it was originally appropriated for? And so I think that has resulted in some more concentrated thinking on, is this really a temporary purpose or is it not? And if it is a permanent purpose, we have mechanisms in Wyoming law to handle that, where a more robust injury analysis takes place. I think part of the concept here was it's just temporary. We still have to, and any change you do with Wyoming water, right, the base consideration is injury to other rights. But if we're only doing it temporarily, we can make it administratively easier so it's not overly burdensome for people to avail themselves upon it. But if it's going to be a more permanent thing, we need to dig deeper into potential injury to other water rights. And so as I think about a concern of extending it or making it perpetually renewable, that's the main thing that I think about, is the level of scrutiny given to the injury, if it's for an actual permanent use or if it's a temporary use. Those are my thoughts.
Madam Chairman, thank you. And so what if you put a year limit on it, right? You gotta, shall not exceed whatever, and then, but your total temporary, your total temporary transfer can't be renewed longer than XXX, right? 30 years or whatever that you might put in there. So at least you have the certainty for up to a certain length of time. So that can transpire. And then, this is really digging into the weeds. But it's something I think we ultimately need to understand. And I've talked about this before, is we get to the end of one of these temporary exchange or temporary use exchanges, whatever you want to call it, temporary use transfers. I've no longer, and I'm the one doing it, right, down to whoever. I do it, let's say, to town of Green River. I'm no longer, I know this forgives me from the 5-year thing, right? That's a big deal. But ultimately, I'm not consumptively using the land that it was on prior to. And so then how's that gonna work in relationship to all of these other issues we're dealing with on the Colorado River? You know, would I then have the ability to do that again, but going back and using the consumptive use that was originally on the landscape prior to it? Or would somebody have to, and I guess that depends on the contract you envision. But do you lose consumptive use? How does the state gonna view consumptive use on the land? Or how have you when a temporary use permit's in place?
Madam Chair, I
Go
will,
ahead.
I will start and Chris can provide some more history. But that is one of the concerns is if you have this temporary agreement for a long period of time and say that you're not watering for 20 years, what is the analysis when that goes back to you? What does that look like? What do those junior rights who have come to the system since that time and expect? How is that different? And so that is part of the analysis of when we go back out of this temporary agreement. The other issue could be that these start piling up. And as they keep piling up, they're a quicker look and a quicker approval than analyzing all of the impacts of all of these together. So as they aggregate and become more and more and more, how is that changing the system too? So those are some of the things to think about on long term, as well as multiple and multiple and multiple. And
Go ahead. All right, any other questions? We are kind of running behind, but I think we could possibly approach that via email unless somebody's wanting to take action on this bill today. What were you thinking? Those who brought this before us.
Madam Chairman, I'd like to move a draft and keep this moving, but,
Okay,
or maybe what we should do is I would like to see another draft where we just modify the existing statute. And that's actually pretty simple. It's 110, 111, and I believe 112 that deals with the language of railroad bed construction or repair. So it would go in there and change the title on those just to say right to acquire temporary water rights for temporary purposes. And then we could go into 110 and just strike out all the language about the Transportation Commission and all that stuff. They're still eligible under the statutes. It just doesn't call those out. And then my recommendation in that draft would be to do a temporary use agreement up to 5 years with no more than 2 renewals. So they could go for 15 years. And we could debate that whether it's 1 renewal. So that gives them 10 years. But I do think the 5-year thing makes sense to me from a standpoint, and it's up to, doesn't mean you have to do it for 5. You could just do 1 agreement up to 5 years and then renew that 1 time. And then you hit that 10-year and then you're gonna have to make a decision to do permanent. But rather than try to work this bill,
yes.
my suggestion would be that we just draft up another bill and then look at those side by side at the next meeting.
Senator Hicks, that was my thoughts exactly. I think that we could make it a lot simpler and it makes a lot of sense to kind of, I mean, unless you guys have a reason not to align that with the abandonment period rather than every 2 years, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but if without objection, if there's no objection from the committee, we will have the bill drafted just as we have discussed it for the next meeting when we meet in Pinedale for our consideration.
Madam Chair,
Go ahead.
no objection.
Okay.
Just a suggestion. I don't know if you all think it would be helpful to maybe get some of the players who've been talking about this into a little working group to work through some of those issues as that bill gets drafted. I don't want to delay it. I just want to get it in the best possible shape so we can act on it because we're running short with our interim.
Absolutely.
No,
That's a
I
great
think-
suggestion. Thank you.
Madam Chairman, and I think that's what we do. This is not a big draft. I think
No.
working with staff, we could probably have this out maybe even before Pinedale, at least get it back to the committee. You know, the committee has plenty of time to look at it, get their comments back. Obviously, we want reviewed by the AG's office and the stage engineers before the next meeting and get that done. And then, so we've got something that people have had a chance to look at, so. But Madam Chairman, I think it would just provide staff direction to do that. I don't think it requires a vote on that. It's just this.
No, it's
Just-
without objection. So unless someone's objecting, go ahead.
Madam Chairman, thank you. No, I'm not objecting. I do think it's important that the state engineer and the Attorney General's office, I think we need to at least Senator Hicks and them and staff, you know, and I'd be willing to sit in on that as well. We need to have a conversation about, is there ways we can construct this that makes sense? Is it going to solve problems that we think it's going to solve? Is it's going to cause more problems? Then we need to have that conversation, I think, before we hit Pinedale if possible.
Absolutely. I completely agree. Raise your hand if you'd like to be on the working group. All right, so there's 3 of you. You're on it whether you like it or not. So, and you guys can herd these cats. So, all right, anything else? Any public comments on temporary use agreements? Any public comment? Any online? Seeing none, is there any further discussion or business to come before the Select Water Committee today? Otherwise, we will adjourn for lunch, and then I just wanted to give Jason a chance to tell us about, oh, he already left. No, there he is. So here's the agenda, guys. Tomorrow is the tour. This afternoon is the workshop with our Water Commission. If you'd like to come, that's not mandatory, but it's always good information, especially reviewing the projects we'll be voting on Thursday. On Wednesday, we'll have a tour of the area water projects. Jason, where are we meeting? And could you we have some new committee members. Could you just give them a little summary of what we're doing tomorrow? Or Wednesday, I mean, yeah, tomorrow. In case someone doesn't come this afternoon, then they'll be up to speed, where to meet, what we're doing. That'll be fine, Barry, come on up. I don't know if everyone's coming to the workshop, so let's get them corralled while we have them. The workshop starts this afternoon at 1:30. If you're a little late from lunch, I'm sure they won't kick you out when you get here. So that's okay. Thank you, Barry.
Sure.
Welcome.
Thank you. Madam Chairman, what's being handed out is the agenda
Thanks,
for
Bill.
tomorrow's tour. As Jason said, I was going to go through it this afternoon, but we're happy to do it now real quick. I think we've got a great day planned for you. The first thing I want to say, due to safety concerns, the Bureau of Reclamation has asked that we have no open-toed shoes tomorrow, okay? We will meet promptly at 8 o'clock. We've got quite a day planned at 8 o'clock at the Hampton Inn in the parking lot. And we have a couple of vehicles. We have a bus and a van and a couple trailing vehicles. We will go up to Buffalo Bill Dam where Mark Skorick and Liz Cresto with the Bureau will give us a tour. We're first going to go to the spillway in the dam. And then about halfway while we're there, we will go down below and we'll go into the power plant, the base of the dam, and so forth. And depending on how many we have, we may have to split the group at that point. Anyway, so we'll spend from 8:15 to about 10 o'clock there at Buffalo Bill. And as I said, I think a lot of opportunities. And one thing I did want to mention, and surprised me, they did say we are allowed to take pictures. And so they said that is a possibility. So if you want to take pictures, and they said there'll be opportunity for some good pictures up there. We'll load the bus, and then 10:15, we are supposed to be at the Shoshone Municipal Pipeline Water Treatment Plant. And Dexter Woodis, who's the chief pipeline operator with SMP, you're going to give us a tour there. We'll walk through that facility. 11:45, we'll load up the bus again, and then we will head down to the park in Cody. And I should mention, Very little driving on this tour. Since we're in the Cody Powell area, the longest drive time we have on a bus is 20 to 25 minutes. So hopefully, I think everybody will appreciate that. So most of the time we'll be looking and viewing things and talking about stuff. So lunch will be at Hugh Smith Park. We will have lunch set up for you there. And then at the end of our lunch, the Director of Public Works, Cody, Phil Bowman, will be there to talk about Cody and some of the issues they're dealing with. We'll also talk about studies with our office and so forth. We'll then load up again and we'll go over to Willwood Dam. This is the longest drive of the day, 25 minutes. And we'll go to Willwood Dam and we have three speakers. Trep Smoger, who is the manager for Willwood Irrigation District, will be speaking. We also have Brian Dieter, who's the area manager of JUB Engineers. He's one of our consultants that are working on that project right now. And then DEQ will be there, David Water Street, planning on discussing also. Obviously, I think you know there's an active working group there for Willwood Dam. We'll then load up the bus again and then need to thank Commissioner Craig when he gets here this afternoon for lining up the next one. We're going to go look at a Beartooth seed cleaning plant. Commissioner Craig arranged that for us. I guess they got new facilities and so forth. We'll spend some time over there talking about industry and so forth in the basin. And then lastly, we'll head over to Commissioner Craig's place and we'll end up and he would like to talk about some on-farm water applications. And so we're starting at the top end of the system, going down a ways down the system. And then we'll finally finish up with, we have a dinner planned with a cookout there at the park in Powell. And that also was arranged by Commissioner Craig. So, and then we'll have a bus going back to Cody and the Hampton Inn. So expect to be back to the hotel around 6:45. I was not informed that you would need Commissioner.
Only a few of you.
Senator.
Raise your hand if you want to be on the committee. All right,
So anyway, that's what we have planned.
all right. Thank you very much.
very
We
welcome.
appreciate it. And if some of us aren't here this afternoon, we'll see you in the morning.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, thank you. All right, is there any further discussion? Seeing none, we're adjourned for the day